the one-shot decision problems are useless, they are actually useful in some cases. But they are much less complex and much less interesting on the whole than sequential decision making, where every decision can potentially affect every other decision. Doesn't have to, but it could. Okay? Okay. So that's just one thing. So anyway, so agent functions is basically we are trying to write a program that runs this agent, which tells it how to kind of look at the percepts that are flowing in, which is the observations, and then compute the action that it should do. So the function takes the sequence of percepts, not just the current percept, because remember, everything that you have done before is also relevant in deciding what you should do next. Right? So it takes the percept sequence and then it does an action. And one interesting point, of course, is we'll say percept sequence, which is the sensory observations. In the worlds where the state is completely observable, the sequence of percepts is actually the sequence of states. In the worlds where it is not completely observable, the percepts are actually giving you only partial information about the states of the world you had gone through. And yet you have to decide what an action should be. Okay? So an agent program essentially is trying to go from percept sequences into actions. That's it. That's all the program. Input, percept sequences, output, and action. Such that among the whole set of such agent programs, you want the one that will be optimal with respect to the performance metric that has been provided. Okay? So that's what an intelligent agent design is. Okay? Now, so in terms of agents, or what he called rational agents, again, as I said, an agent basically is looking at the history of the percepts that it's been given. It's not just the one state, not just what happened after this last action. It's what happened up until now. Okay? And based on that, it's making its decisions. And when I actually evaluate the agent, I too look at the sequence of the states that it has gone through. In fact, one small difference, the agent may well look at only the percepts. But me, from outside, okay, will look at the real states it has gone through. Because I might know exactly the states it has gone through. And I look at all the states it has gone through and then give it, this sequence, I look at this sequence and say, okay, this is the level of your performance. Yes? So this slide is actually about performance. That is externally evaluated performance of the agent. Remember that the agent was taking percept sequences, deciding action. So it takes, let's say, P0, A1, P1, A2, P2, A3, and so on. Okay? So what it thought was, in the case where actually the world is completely observable, these P0, P1, P2, etc. are just S0, S1, S2, etc. When it's not observable, they're just different. They're partial information about the states. But when it's being evaluated, an external agent is looking at the performance. And it's looking at the actual states it has gone through. Do you see what I'm saying? To get yourself into this mode, imagine you don't have eyes. Imagine you are blind, and imagine you are deaf. Imagine you also probably are missing, smell sense, etc. Lots and lots of senses. So maybe part senses. So maybe you will see, you're colorblind, for example, or you don't have long distance vision, etc. So what you see about the world is essentially the percept sequence. Right? Now, if I'm trying to get you, who has these sensory limitations, and compare your performance with somebody who has no sensory limitations, do you see what I'm saying? I will still look at the states that you have gone through. How many times are you guys bonking your head against a wall? How many times are you tripping? How many times are you falling into people? all these states I can see. You can't see because you are not, until it happens, you may not have seen. So you would have done an action that may have made you trip. The other guy who does an action and would make sure that they won't trip. You see what I'm saying? So the actual states that other guy has gone through would be better states, so they will get a higher performance. You would get a lower performance. This is true. We as a civilized society try to reduce that inequality, especially if there are congenital defects about blindness and deafness, etc. We try to make things accessible. But it's clear that reaching a level of performance is harder for people who don't have sensory information than the people who do. So here is a way of thinking about it. If somebody trips, somebody with full eyesight trips and falls, it's great fun, we should all laugh. Somebody blind trips and falls, you laugh, everybody will yell at you. You see what I'm saying? So there's an expectation that the guy who had the eyes could have seen that they were going to trip, could have made a decision that could have stopped that fall. Bozo did not. So we get to laugh at the bozo. Somebody who can't see could not have made a better decision. It requires a certain level of sadism to laugh at that. You see what I'm saying? Yes.
So something that's considered not rational in a complete environment can be considered rational in a partial environment?
No, there is no such thing as complete and partial environment. It's the environment that you have, okay, and the performance metric that you have. Okay, we will talk about, by the way, these blind deaf aspects a little more in today's class, because it actually, in fact, one of the beautiful things about this course really, especially thinking about intelligent agents, is it gives you a humongous number of lessons about day-to-day life. The stuff that you most normal people have already internalized them. Most normal people hopefully didn't have to be told that they shouldn't laugh when a blind person trips. Although they're completely fine laughing when the teacher trips. Especially if the teacher is not blind again, right? So my point is, you know this already, and we can make sense of this in the context of the agent performance as measured by outside world versus agent performance as measured by the inside, the agent itself. When it made the decision with respect to the facts it had. And if the sensory information is missing, it has limited information. Okay? Yes?
So, doesn't the state of the environment depend on, so for example, if the agent has made an action and that affects, for example, if I'm switching lanes and that affects the environment, then that action is caused and then we perceive it, right?
Yeah.
So doesn't the perception come after the environment state has changed?
Yeah, so what happened?
So shouldn't we base the...
That's a very good point. Actually, this becomes, by the way, many of these questions, one of the problems with this discussion here is if you can replay this lecture multiple times during the semester, it makes more and more sense. Okay? So one of the interesting things that you just asked is, imagine when you do an action, it's not predictable. You don't know exactly what will happen after the action is done. So I'm about to toss a coin. What will happen? You can't predict it. And yet you have to decide. Nobody, people do make a decision, right? Who gets to play? You have to pick which side the coin comes, right? You can say, no, that's a stochastic action. Let the coin fall, I'll tell you which one I want. Why is that not reasonable? It's not reasonable because you need to make the decisions to see the outcomes. After the outcomes, all you can say is whether or not somebody lived a reasonable life, that's all. But if it's your life, you have to live the life. You have to make the decisions with the incomplete information that you have at that point of time. It's an extremely important thing. We live in a world in general where you, at any given point of time, only have very partial information about the world you have. And you have to make decisions based on that. And it's very hard to make those decisions. That's why we need to be intelligent. And you could make a decision that a posteriori might look silly. Okay? But you have to make the decision to see the outcome. You can't very well say, I won't change my lane until I know what will happen after I change the lane. You do make the change of the lane and see a huge crash behind you and say, sorry. Okay, that's how you live. That's how we live. It's a very interesting point to keep in mind. In fact, just because we say this, I'll say that there is a distinction. In a couple of classes, we will get to something called Markov decision processes, MDPs. And there are multiple kinds of MDPs. One is called fully observable Markov decision process. Other is called POMDP, partially observable Markov decision process. The main difference is in the case of fully observable, when you are about to take an action, you don't know what will happen. But after the action, you know exactly what happened. In the case of partially observable, you may not know what happens when you are about to take an action. After it too, you don't know what happened. This will be like playing blind chess, Kriegspiel, where you basically close your eyes and play chess. And that's what blind people are actually to some extent doing in the world. They're making actions, and sometimes they won't necessarily right away understand what the outcome of the action is. It's not like, oh, I was blind when I was making the action, now I get to see what happened. That's what you get to do. They don't get to do that. They have to live in a partially observable world and yet reach their goals. Okay? That's why their life is much harder than yours. Okay, so anyway, so you look at the history and then you apply some function to the history. Whatever the function is that performance metric. So for example, as a society, we have decided that everything, all that matters is how wealthy you were when you were 32 years old. That's it. That's the performance metric. By that performance metric, which can be applied to this because S35, let's say these are states at every year on your birthday, let's say. So S35, how much ever money you have on that particular state, that's your performance metric. By that, Jeffrey Epstein was amazing success. But there could also be a different performance metric, how much money you had when you died on the day after your death. That's also not necessarily a good performance metric. That could be somebody's performance metric. Or they could be total amount of, some average amount of money you had. Or why even money, average amount of happiness you had. All of these are different kinds of performance metrics. But they can all be applied to the state sequence. The important thing is, if you think in terms of state sequences, which are the trajectories, and you realize that performance is a function of the trajectories that you go through. That's just a shorthand, a longhand notation for saying the value of your life is your entire life. If you keep on being mean to your friends and one day give them $1,500, that doesn't necessarily make you a nice guy, for some people at any rate. Because they might say, those many days you are a jerk, 1,500 days is not going to cut it. $1,500 is not going to cut it. That's a reasonable performance metric to have about people. Okay? Now, here is the other interesting question. The specific states that you go through are fixed. After your life is over, I know exactly the states you have gone through. The problem is the actions you do in the world you are in, because of the incomplete observations, as well as because the actions can be stochastic, that means you don't know what effects they will have. You did what you thought was the best possible thing, and yet you went into a state that was really bad in your life. Do you see what I'm saying? So for example, a fireman, a firewoman sees a particular, the house on fire, basically tries to say that we should just run in and then save the little kid. That looks like a good action. It may so happen that while they were trying to run out, the whole building collapsed, the fireman died, the baby died. And after the fact, we realized that there could have been, first of all, some other fireman may not have had that bad luck. Performance should not be decided based on luck. Performance should be decided based on whether you thought or did not think about the problem, not based on your luck. How do you deal with that? You consider expected performance. If the agent's decisions were done multiple times, it might have had multiple different outcomes. It only lives one life, but it could have had multiple different outcomes. Okay? So you can essentially look at the decisions that the agent made, not just the states, but the actions it did. And then see if these actions were done by somebody else, on the average, what would be their performance? That's the expected performance. A rational agent will try to optimize the expected performance. You cannot optimize the performance that you will get just for your life, especially given all the uncertainty. Again, it's a very complex idea to understand. You do this in your life, but you probably didn't think about it. Right? For example, otherwise, what's the point? Some people study for the exam. Some people just show up for the exam. And in some cases, in some classes, probably not this class, the people just showed up for the exam might get a better grade, might actually do fine. Whereas the person who studied, freezes during the exam and doesn't do well. So is that supposed to mean that studying for the exam is a bad policy or a good policy? You have to consider that in terms of expectations, not just what happened to one specific person. When somebody said, honesty is the best policy, what did they mean? Did they mean that if you're honest, you would never actually ever in your life get a raw deal? Of course you will get a raw deal. But on the whole, in a lifetime of being honest versus dishonest, honesty is a better policy. Expected performance is better. It's a much harder thing to grasp. But that's what an agent can optimize for. An agent cannot optimize for stuff that it can't control. The thing you can control is, I am going to toss a coin. What I can't control is what it will come, whether it comes heads or tails. Okay? So you will only be seen as a bad agent or a dumb agent or an unintelligent agent if you did not exercise your choices correctly in the context of the information you've been given. That's the beauty of this little definition. Okay? Okay, so we basically talk about agents in terms of the percepts they get, actions they get, goals they have, and environments. And so some examples, we'll go a little faster now. For example, the taxi agent, percepts might be some video information, accelerometer information, the different gauges, engine sensors, GPS information, etc. These are all percepts that it's getting. The kinds of actions it can get: steering, accelerating, braking, using horn, speaking, displaying, the kind of displays that you are particularly good at doing when you are driving, that involves fingers. All of those are actions. Okay, those are all the actions you get to do. Goals: safety, reaching destination, maximizing profits, obeying laws, passenger comfort. These are actually sometimes conflicting goals. In fact, if one Uber driver gets you to your destination 3 full minutes ahead, but you had to hold your life in your hand because the guy or the woman was just weaving through the traffic and almost got into different accidents, but you are 3 minutes ahead of time. Another Uber driver essentially basically went so slow that there was no accident, but you reached tomorrow. And a third Uber driver sort of did some sort of a trade-off between these. The question is, whose performance would you like? Again, remember that performance metrics are set by the designer. If you are into slow, I mean, if you want to, you can always get a self-driving car and tell it, by all means take your time. I just don't want to ever have a probability of greater than 0.005 that we can get into an accident. So then the car basically might come up with a policy that involves making 2 or 3 feet of travel at midnight, stopping again for the next midnight, some more 3 feet travel because there's no traffic at that time. There's much less chance of accidents, etc. But that's your performance metric and it is. That's fine. Okay. So how these goals are combined into a single performance metric is essentially again designer specific. Okay, we tend to think that the society has a particular idea about this, but it's not necessary, that we all agree. Okay, so these are the goals, of course. And the environments for the cars, of course, would be urban streets, freeways, traffic, pedestrians, weather, customers, all this stuff is part of the environment. Slippery roads, hurricanes, everything is part of the environment. Okay. So the one interesting thing that I want you to think about is how do these affect the complexity of the problem the rational agent faces? Let's talk about it in a qualitative sense. If I don't have percepts, if I have very incomplete information versus I have a lot of information about the environment, how does that affect the performance? You would think full percepts will give you a chance to have higher performance. If you have no percepts, you will have a chance to have lower performance. But I wrote something else here. Performance is not equal to thinking cost. If you look at the traffic, sometimes it's very mind-boggling. You have to look at what's going on. The best way to go fast is close your eyes, honk, and just go. And just do it. You see what I'm saying? That doesn't hurt your brain. It might hurt your entire body because there's a car wreck. But it doesn't hurt your brain. You know what I just said? You can actually say that closing your eyes makes your life easy in terms of the amount of thinking you have to do, amount of computation you have to do. But the moment you have fewer sensors, the level of performance you can get to is limited. These are two very different things. We tend to confuse them. You see what I'm saying? Sometimes you might tend to confuse them. You say, wow, this guy is with not as much as good an eyesight as me, don't seem to see the dirt in the environment. And they have a much happier life. If you have a roommate, the roommate just magically doesn't see any dirt in the environment. He or she is having a much nicer life than you. Because you're like, oh my dirt, oh my dirt, oh my dirt. And you're wasting your time cleaning. But unless your roommate is setting herself a different performance metric, if there's an external performance metric, with respect to that, you can prove that closing your eyes cannot be a universally good strategy. It will always limit your upper limit on the performance you can get. Remember, one of the choices you can do is not to use your senses. So you can close your eyes. You can do this. That doesn't change the world, unfortunately. I never understood this nonsense of those monkeys which close their eyes, close their ears, and close their mouth. Those are stones, they're not monkeys. Because they're not actually interacting with the environment. Okay? You have to interact with the environment and decide what to do, what's the best actions you can do. Okay, lack of actions makes performance harder. For example, if you're put in a car where the steering wheel doesn't work, remember the ones that you did in the Disney World when you were a little kid? You feel as if you're in control, but nothing is happening because the car is being controlled by somebody else, right? So there are no actions that you could take. If you don't take actions, then you will have an upper limit on the performance compared to somebody who has actions that they can take on the same environment. Similarly, if you have complex goals, that makes performance harder, because if you have to kind of consider multiple trade-offs, multiple mutually conflicting trade-offs, that makes it hard to get a performance, high performance. Okay? So it's kind of worthwhile remembering, and the most important thing I hope you'll remember is this difference between external performance and computational cost. Okay, like having a good night's sleep and going to see a movie and having a good night's sleep takes much less computational studying cost before the exam. You would have a silly smile by the next morning, but that smile might change after the exam. Right? Okay, so then how about the environment? So the environment itself actually again is connected to all of these. So the actions that I have may be instantaneous. The moment I do the action, the effect is observed. Or durative. I make this action, after a bunch of time the effect is observed. In the real world, both kinds of actions are there. If you want to, for example, think of, pretty much it's true everywhere actually, but the thing that comes to my mind is the way Fed tries to control economy. They'll do something, they'll change the interest rate. That's an action. It doesn't right away have any impact. It takes a whole bunch of time for you to really understand what its impact has been. So those are durative actions. The more important one is deterministic versus stochastic. If you do an action, before doing the action, you know exactly what the state would be. If you know the current state, and it was a deterministic action, then before doing the action, you know exactly what the state would be. And then you do the action, that state will happen. Stochastic means before doing the action, you only have partial information about what states might be. So for example, when I'm about to toss a coin, it might come heads, it might come tails. That's uncertainty. And the uncertainty can be quantified. In the case of tossing a coin, it might come heads exactly. If it's a fair coin, heads come 50% of the time, tails come 50% of the time. If it is a heavily biased coin, head might come 90% of the time, and tails might come 10% of the time. If it is a completely biased coin, which has heads on both sides, heads will come 100% of the time, tails will come 0% of the time. That's a deterministic coin. Right? I mean, the enough Indians, the Cholet coin is a deterministic coin. Okay? And so that's about the deterministic versus stochastic distinction. In terms of the environment, it may be static or dynamic. Static means the environment waits for you to do actions. It's in a state, and while you're off deciding what action to do, it just waits for you patiently. When you do the action, the environment state changes. That's what static means. Anything else is dynamic. That means if the environment keeps changing while you are trying to decide what your next action is, then it's a dynamic environment. It's much harder to live in a dynamic environment than a static environment, because static environment say, environment stop, I'm going to go start my computer program, 3 days later I'll say this is the action, and then you do the action. So a chess without time limits, for example, is easier, right? Because you can take forever to think of what your next move is. Whereas going on a freeway, that's a dynamic environment. If you don't make a decision, somebody is making the decision for you. Okay? Observable versus partially observable. That's the other distinction. Okay? Is the environment state observable to you or not? And it actually is connected to some extent, observable versus partially observable is connected to perfect versus imperfect sensors. So an environment might by and large be observable for most agents, but not to you because you don't have eyesight. Let's say. So a combination of your sensors and whether or not the environment is inherently observable or not might decide whether the agent knows what the current state of the environment is before doing the action. Only if not, it will only know a sort of a distribution over the state of the world. You might think, yeah, I think it might be the state 1 with 0.5 probability, state 2 with 0.2 probability, state 3 with 0.3 probability. So that's basically knowing less information than complete information. And if it can be any of these states, then you have to consider any of these things being important and decide what action to do. So if you went to your doctor and you said, I have this kind of a complex pain in my chest or something, and they're trying to decide what action to do, whether to give this medicine M1 or operation O1 on you, those are the two actions they might expect to do. The point, of course, is it is possible that just based on the symptom, they don't know exactly what your disease is. And it is possible that the medicine that they give might cure you if you have the disease and kill you if you don't have the disease. In fact, there are many such medicines, kill you or get you closer to the death. Like for example, you don't willy-nilly go and get some amount of chemotherapy. Even though chemotherapy is a good thing for people with cancer, it's a good thing because instead of dying with cancer, chemotherapy at least gives you some chance of surviving the cancer. You just can't go and give some symptoms that are sort of maybe consistent with cancer. I start doing chemotherapy on you. Then in essence, basically that will have very negative consequences for you. So when you came with symptoms, I have to realize that there is this much chance that you have actually this disease and a lower chance that you're okay, or vice versa. At that point, I have two possibilities. One is decide what action to do, or decide more tests. Tests are actions too. In US, you'll get more tests. Why? Because insurance essentially will pay for the test, and if they ever make a decision that winds up being wrong in your single case, even for a doctor who had expected performance over a lifetime very high, but in your single case, some action they did essentially wound up kind of paralyzing you or something, you would sue them. Or if, most likely, if not you, your friends will sue them. And they will lose gazillion amount of money. And so the doctors know this. And so they say, let's do as many tests as possible because the tests are paid for before making a decision. Sometimes that's a rational thing, depending on how the performance metric is.